Okay, I suggest we get going. Do we all agree? So it gives me more pleasure than is average for me to introduce my lovely daughter Tanya, who is, even though her title theoretically is assistant curator at the National Portrait Gallery, she's actually in reality a curator, as evidence would support. And this evening, this book, Paper Bullets, is about two artists who, as it says on the front cover, as you can see, risked their lives to defy the Nazis. 4 years they were doing so in Jersey. And in life's lovely coincidences, when I was reading this book, I realized that one of the artists, Claude Cahun, is an artist that was profiled at an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery that Tanya was very responsible for and did publicized YouTube interviews on and so on, paralleling her work with a contemporary, actually Birmingham-born artist who's very well known. So Tanya has an immense knowledge on this subject and therefore was a real natural selection to facilitate a presentation on this book and our discussion. And Tan's going to give an introduction, and then I'm going to just prompt conversation on a number of topics. And what I would suggest is that any questions anyone wants to raise during that part, which is going to be the greatest part of the evening, the majority of this whole 1 hour book club event, then either unmute yourself and talk or put the questions or comments on the chat line. So without further ado, let me introduce you now to Tan.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is a real pleasure for me. I'm very much, I'm on maternity leave at the moment from my role at the National Portrait Gallery. So this is a pleasant break from the newborn haze and fog to get back into some kind of art historical things. And as my dad mentioned, I'm here chairing this evening because of the exhibition in 2017 that I helped curate. And that's really how I came to know of the stories of Claude Cahun, also known as Lucy Schwab, and her lifelong partner, Suzanne Malherbe, who also was known by the alias Marcel Moore. And it's interesting, just perhaps we could pick up on this later, but the author of Paper Bullets, Jeffrey Jackson, would perhaps question the whole premise of the exhibition from 2017, because the premise was to compare the self-portraits of a contemporary artist with the 20th century surrealist Claude Cahun. But as he argues convincingly throughout the book, all of Cahun, or Lucy Schwab's photographs, were really collaborations with her partner. And so whether the title self-portrait is really valid, that should be questioned. So I'll, as my dad mentioned, I'm going to just summarize quite briefly what Paper Bullets is about. And then we will discuss in some more detail just a few points which I've picked up on throughout the book, which I think are particularly interesting. So Paper Bullets by Jeffrey Jackson looks at the lives of the writer Lucy Schwab, because she thought of herself predominantly as a writer rather than an artist, and her partner Suzanne Malherbe, who was at the time an illustrator and artist. But it looks at their lives particularly during World War II. So they both came from affluent French families from Nantes in Western France, and Lucy came from a Jewish literary family. She was Jewish by her father's side. And they actually met when they were very young in school in Nantes. And Lucy referred to Suzanne as l'autre moi in French, which means the other me. They were kind of tied at the hip, and they became lifelong partners. And in a strange twist of fate, they also became stepsisters, because Lucy's father married Suzanne's widowed mother. Together, they moved to Paris in the early 1920s, adopting their artistic gender-neutral names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Interestingly, Cahun chooses, which is sort of an argument for how she did have an affiliation with her Jewishness, because she chose to be known as Cahun, which was her grandmother on her paternal side. That was her name. So Cahun being a French version of Cohen. So that she clearly did have some sort of affiliation with her Jewish identity. And in Paris, they participated in the avant-garde scene there, including the surrealist milieu. They knew André Breton, for example. And it's there that they created these incredible photographic collaborations alongside their sort of literary and artistic private endeavors. And which today they are most well known for. And I'm going to kind of pull up some of these images just for you to look at, and perhaps you'll be familiar. Ooh, if it will go. Perhaps you'll be familiar. Oh, sorry, I skipped this slide out, but this is just the two of them. On the left, you see Suzanne Malherbe, and on the right is Lucy Schwab. And I love this image on the right with the star on Lucy's chest, because you can see Suzanne Malherbe in the background, just a nod to sort of the photographic collaborations. Lucy would sort of be at the front of stage, and then Suzanne was in the background taking the image. Anyway, so these are the sorts of things that they collaborated on in the 20s. These kind of very innovative images in which Lucy, who almost always was the protagonist in the picture, performs and pushes the boundaries of gender identity. And it's these images which have a lot of contemporary resonance today. And I think that's why they are becoming kind of increasingly famous as artists. In 1937, the women become increasingly disillusioned with life in Paris in the 30s, and want to get away from the spread of fascism. And so they moved to the Isle of Jersey. And this is an island which they are very familiar with from regular family holidays that they used to go on together with their father and mother and Suzanne's mother. They bought a house and renovated it, and they lived very remotely in this kind of beautiful large granite house called La Roquaise, which had an expansive view of St. Brelard's Bay. And they live in relative isolation, carrying on their photographic collaborations. They painted, they wrote letters and poetry, and sunbathed naked in their beautiful gardens there. These are some of the images that they took during this time. And then this idyll kind of came to an end when the Nazis occupied Jersey from 1940. And it's this part of their lives that the book Paper Bullets really focuses on. And I think what's great about the book is that it really diverges from current historiography about their lives. Previous literature that I've read, there's never really been enough material on their wartime experience during Nazi-occupied Jersey. And Jackson has clearly done a lot of research to uncover this story. And he says throughout the book, he believes that they have been written out of the history of World War II resistance. So he's trying to bring their story to light. And so with amazing detail, sometimes recreating episodes from their lives with kind of dialogue, which is based on archival material, and beautiful descriptions drawn from extant photographs, letters, and post-war reminiscences from both Lucy and Suzanne. He recreates their resistance activities against the Nazis. Amongst the detail that he shares is their most daring feat, which was to write and illustrate anti-Nazi leaflets, which they smuggled into German staff cars, cigarette packets, jacket pockets of soldiers, any way really they could think of which might catch the attentions of German soldiers at churches, for example. And these tracts contained messages, sometimes written as poems or jokes or fictional dialogues, that were designed to create the illusion of rebellion or mutiny amongst the German troops. And over 4 years, the Germans never suspected that two middle-aged women dressed in sort of little headscarves and Burberry trench coats would be able to carry out pull off what they did. And some of the notes were actually kind of news items from the BBC, because they were carrying on listening to the BBC on the radio, despite the fact that it was illegal to do so. And then Suzanne, who knew German, would translate these bits of news it would translate the bits of news that we're hearing in English into German for the soldiers to then read through these tracts. They were eventually caught and imprisoned and sentenced to death in 1944, which is something that Jackson goes into a lot of detail in the book. So, as I said, 4 years after they had started their resistance activities, which is quite remarkable that they're able to kind of carry on with this level of rebellion without the Germans finding out. Unfortunately, despite spending time in prison, their sentences were commuted and they were then released from prison when Jersey was liberated. So there's my little introduction, and then I think now we'll go into some of kind of interesting details from the book.
Thank you. The first thing I want to comment on is Suzanne and Lucy's story reveal the different types of resistance that took place during the war. And I'd like to read from page 272, just a short section, where it says, Lucy and Suzanne's experience also raises a broad human question of why and how two people with so many secrets and with everything to lose resisted in such extraordinary circumstances. The women they were, as lesbians, as artists engaged in left-wing politics, helped them resist the Nazis in their own unique way. And that's the key point, because they had been pushing against social norms, political values, and legal strictures for years. In the end, Lucy and Suzanne remind us that a private life lived in struggle can prepare us for the larger battles to come. And they show that love can carry us through just about anything. Tana, what I want to ask you is whether you can elaborate on Lucy's concept of indirect action. Their unique way was one form of indirect action, which is a big subject in terms of Nazi oppression and resistance.
Yeah, I think for me, what I took from the book is that their story speaks to the diverse nature of resistance to Nazi occupation during World War II, and they certainly used their creative talents through their very unique way of resisting. And what is interesting is that Lucy had this idea of indirect action. It's something she articulated in Paris in the 1930s. She wrote an essay that was at the time very kind of not widely recognized, but recognized amongst the sort of surrealist milieu and recognized amongst the academic bodies there, called Les Paris sont ouverts, which means it's anybody's guess. And in this tract, she talks about what artists should do to resist and how they can be politically effective, if not like on the front line. And she argues that actually propaganda doesn't work because it's too in your face. And so artists instead should try to plant seeds in the minds of others to get them to change their minds through poetry, a story, or photographs that could have a profound psychological effect. And so when Jersey was occupied by the Nazis in 1940, Lucy had the opportunity to put her philosophy into practice. And this is how they started their counter propaganda tracks, their notes to the Nazis, or Suzanne referred to them as their news service to the Nazis. In her interrogation with the police following their arrest, Suzanne admits that the German intelligence police had only procured 1/10 of the tracks they had made, and they had a full file of about 300 there. Actually, on the next slide, this is a couple of images of that they took. The one on the right was taken illegally because you weren't allowed to have cameras once the Nazis occupied. But it shows the view from their house of Nazi soldiers arriving on the bay in Jersey, and their cat kind of looking on. So I guess an example of a quiet act of resistance. And then this one on the left is just Cahun, Lucy Schwab in the house, but perhaps foreshadowing the sort of arrest to come. These are examples of the tracks that have survived in Jersey Heritage Trust. And the one, they would use all sorts of different methods to try to create the impression that it was a much larger operation than it really was. So they had an Underwood typewriter, which was also completely illegal, and they would sort of press more firmly sometimes, or lighter touch, just to create this impression that different people were operating the machines. And this one on the left, I've put the translation here, but it was written in the wake of the German loss at the Battle of Stalingrad and German failure during the North Africa campaigns. They were really trying to frighten soldiers into realizing the kind of sinking reality of the war. The other resistance activities that they did, these indirect actions, if you like, were small but often quite perhaps even humorous things. So during church services, they would drop coins that said "down with war" into the collection plate, like a very subtle way of resistance. Yet when a soldier would find this note and it sounds like the voice of another German soldier written in German, that would be quite shocking for them. And this is an example of a sort of an indirect effect of getting a soldier to think, why on earth am I here in Jersey? Actually, I'm missing my family. So they were not engaging with the sort of Nazi ideological issues of race to appeal to these soldiers. They just wanted to try to talk to them in a language which they would understand, to foment resentment against the war and German leadership. Another example that Jackson brings to light that I didn't know beforehand was that whenever there was a German funeral, they would lay wooden crosses on the grave of the person that died with the inscription, "For you, the war is over," i.e. you're no longer suffering, which kind of completely went against the Nazi ideology that glorified war. So yes, I think these indirect actions actually had incredible resonance. And I think that the next point we'll go on, we'll elaborate on this even further. And we can think about it even more.
So exactly, following on from that, if you look at chapter 8, it's titled "The Soldier with No Name," and I'd like to read a short section on this on page 98, where it says, "In essence, the soldier with no name was an unknown soldier. After World War I, tombs to unknown soldiers became sites of tremendous national emotion across Europe, especially in Germany, condensing the horror of the war experience into the fallen body of one comrade who stood in for all the rest." And so I know what it means to me, and there are so many thoughts and meanings from this concept, this title, "The Soldier with No Name." But when you think of the millions of soldiers who perished, for what purpose, unknown, unnamed, often without any trace, it's a powerful image of the oppression of the few on so many in their different forms. But your views, please, on this.
So eventually, Lucy and Suzanne think that these tracks could be more effective if they pin it on one person. So they choose this name, "The Soldier with No Name." And as my dad just said, it had resonance from World War I, the sort of futility of war. And so that if a German soldier would pick up one of these tracks in their pocket once they'd just been to, say, have a drink somewhere, they would look at it and think, and really want to question the point of it all, and perhaps, was the occupation really failing? What's the point? And another thing that another point that Jackson makes, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that he argues that this persona of the soldier with no name that they adopt stems from Lucy and Suzanne's earlier work from the 1920s and 30s, when they were crossing gender lines and performing different identities in their photographs. So for them, this is yet another one of those iterations of crossing gender lines, and it's another sort of performance for them. But beyond that, I think it had a huge effect. Another example of one of their activities, which I think is just really hit home for me, is that they, in the night, I think, break into St. Brillard's Church, which is the oldest Christian site on the island, and they mount a large white banner using the German national colours of black, red and gold, which was definitely their riskiest move to date, and with the words, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler." So really wanting to just kind of press home the point to the soldiers that would come to church and see this, that there's this gap between the soldiers and the elite who are kind of safe, and whereas the soldiers kind of going to their deaths, and for what purpose. When sentenced, when they were eventually found out and went to trial, the judge said that you are dangerous political criminals, and he referred to the notes that they made, these tracts, as spiritual weapons, which I think is a really apt description of them. And I guess they were also charged with undermining morale, which was the biggest charge against them. And the German intelligence were taking this so seriously. And I guess the biggest evidence of their impact is that they were hunted for 4 years and then eventually sentenced to death. So they were clearly having an effect by creating this persona and creating this impression of mutiny throughout the island. So, yeah.
So just changing tack slightly for a moment, the book is centered on Jersey and life under occupation. And on page 4 of the book, just reading a couple of extracts about background to Jersey and the basis of occupation and so on, around 50,000 people lived on Jersey's 45 square miles when the women arrived in 1937 to make it their permanent home. Jersey had endured many conquerors and foreigners over the centuries, including Romans, Vikings, and Gauls. The French tried to invade Jersey in the 1780s, but the British forces held them off. When the Germans dropped their bombs on Jersey and nearby Guernsey in June 1940, they ended more than 150 years of peace. In terms of the stance that the British government took in relation to Jersey, Guernsey, and the other Channel Islands, again, reading from the book on page 55, London, unable to spare equipment or men to defend the Channel Islands, left Jersey on its own. Winston Churchill argued that it would be repugnant now to abandon British territory, which had been in possession of the Crown since the Norman conquest. But military advisors convinced the Prime Minister the islands would require too many resources needed elsewhere, and Churchill eventually conceded. King George VI sent a message to his loyal subjects. For strategic reasons, it has been found necessary to withdraw the armed forces from the Channel Islands. I deeply regret this necessity, and I wish to assure my people in the islands that in taking this decision, my government has not been unmindful of their position. Well, I mean, clearly they weren't terribly mindful. This was the first time they'd ever been abandoned in this way, and it was an incredibly soft occupation with no resistance. So, I mean, in terms of the context of the residents of the islands, it's interesting. I know one of the people who became friends and showed kindness and so on to them when in prison actually was somebody who was very anti-Semitic. But actually, it seems that the invasion of Jersey counted a lot more for her than her feelings as a first position of actually hating Jewish people, which clearly one of them most certainly was, and bore a name that indicated so. So your further thoughts, if you have any on that.
Yeah, I guess one of the really interesting aspects of this book is that through Lucy and Suzanne's lives, Jackson elaborates on the story of Jersey during World War II. And as you just said, it was the only British-run land to fall to the Nazis. There were only 150 military men and 50 Navy men on Jersey left to defend it, 50,000 residents. It was clearly an afterthought for the military. It was undefended, abandoned, essentially, because they were lacking resources. They were focusing on evacuating Dunkirk and other parts of the British Empire. And I guess they didn't really anticipate the islands becoming a theatre of battle for that the Nazis would actually invade it and see it as a very important strategic military fortification point, which they did eventually. But before reading this book, I didn't know much about what it meant to be under Nazi occupation in Jersey. You know, I don't think they were subject to the sort of things that perhaps the rest of the continent were, but there were curfews, there was rationing. They moved their clocks an hour ahead to be on the same time as Berlin. cars now had to go on the right side of the road. So there was kind of completely mentally they were shifting to be under German rule, and they brought slave labourers from the east to help build these series of fortifications to prevent Allied invasion. And what, before reading this book, I think my impression of resistance in Jersey was there wasn't any resistance in Jersey, or that, naively Suzanne and Lucy's actions were the only examples of resistance. But and I think that was, I read someone's book, that was also Lucy's impression at the time. She thought they were the only people resisting. But there was, as Jackson argues, there was local resistance, mainly through spontaneous acts of aggression towards Nazis. I think he says approximately 4,000 Channel Islanders were sentenced during the occupation for violating German regulations, and from a broad spectrum of society. So there wasn't any large-scale organized resistance, but I guess because they were so cut off from anything, it was quite impossible to do that sort of thing. But these small acts had, such as Lucy and Suzanne's, had very significant effects on the German troops. They believed that British spies were everywhere, and it definitely undermined morale. But yeah, it's an interesting takeaway from the book. This is sort of the history of Jersey during this period, for sure.
And actually, absolutely in line with what you've just said, of course, the Jewish people in Jersey were taken and were sent to concentration camps and met their deaths elsewhere, and there were others too that were killed even on the island. So that even if it was a small, but there was death, there was, so it wasn't entirely free.
No.
So, yeah. Tan mentioned before, after 4 years, they were arrested and they were put on trial, and they went through a long period in prison. And just reading one short section on that, literally at the moment when this first happened, during a quiet dinner, a fist pounded at the door of La Roque's. It was the moment Lucy and Suzanne had been expecting every day for nearly 4 years. The only question was whether the Germans were clever enough to have discovered the women on their own, or if someone had ratted them out. And one of the interesting features of the way in which the author has described their time in jail is the relationship that actually was built up with certain of the prison wardens, who clearly actually were ordinary people, who actually were not necessarily SS officers and so on.
Yeah.
So your comment on that. Please.
Yeah, no, it was, that also really fascinated me. I think I don't know exactly the sources that Jackson's used. I think it's mainly through post-war recollections of Suzanne and Lucy to recreate these moments, because he does it in quite a sort of a way. It almost feels like a bit of historical fiction, the way he's recreating it, but they are all patched together from these post-war recollections. But again, I guess you could argue how valid is that, but I found it very very fascinating reading it, and a really enjoyable read, particularly this moment of when the officers come pounding on their doors. And he goes into a lot of detail about their detainment in prison, and of course it wasn't pleasant, and it certainly was a big, huge difference to their lives of basically luxury that they were living before. They came from affluent families, they didn't have to work, but they didn't suffer physically, and their experiences contrast hugely to what my impressions of German imprisonment throughout World War II. And as you mentioned, they struck up these relationships with their wardens, particularly their main jailer Otto, and he treats them relatively well. When Lucy starts to get ill, he brings her extra food. They were brought blankets, they had access to water. Doctors came to see them. They both attempted suicide at various points. So they clearly felt it important that they were kept alive. So doctors were being sent to them. And they were addressed with terms of deference and respect, Miss Schwab, Miss Mellor, because of their social standing. And I think it's sort of a two-way thing. Lucy and Suzanne very much see these soldiers as regular men doing their duty. Perhaps she even they both, I think, had cousins who died during World War One. So perhaps they saw through them, these young men, just like their cousins. And they seem to have this sort of radical empathy for the enemy and see humanity in these soldiers. And perhaps they genuinely felt that they were being duped by Hitler, as their tracks suggest. And they were a kind of victim, if you like, of the war. And that's perhaps what made their tracks soldiers so effective, because they had this genuine empathy. And I thought we could just look at this image, which was taken presumably by Suzanne of Lucy on the day that she was released from prison in May 1945, and it's also the day that Jersey was liberated. And you know, I know this image well, for it was included in the exhibition, and for me, it's an amazing image of defiance. Lucy is grasping between her teeth a Nazi insignia, but then she's sort of dressed in her trench coat again, with her headscarf, seemingly doesn't seem threatening at all, if you like. But what is so significant is that they were able to retrieve this badge because of their relationships that they had formed with these German soldiers. And I think this book has done a good job of really kind of arguing for the nuanced and complex relationships between those being occupied and the occupiers, if you like. Yeah, I think that's perhaps an element of World War II historiography, or stories, which hasn't really, which I haven't encountered in quite the same way. So I was really impressed by that, and I thought that was a really interesting aspect of the book. And so yeah, so I don't know if anybody else has extra thoughts, comments, or questions, reflections. I'd love to hear them. And yeah.
Could Sophie, could we unmute everyone? I see that's a nod, so I think that's a yes. Excellent. I'd certainly invite any thoughts and questions. I mean, I don't have many more, frankly.
Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Yes.
Firstly, it's very interesting. Thank you so much for that. I haven't read the book, and I would like to do so. It reminded me very much of a book by Hans Fayard called Alone in Berlin, very famous book. And this tells the story of a German couple in Berlin whose son is killed on the Eastern Front. And early in the war, they decide that Hitler is taking the country down the wrong path, and they start distributing leaflets and articles surreptitiously in public places. And there's a cat and mouse game while Gestapo try and track them down. I recommend it. It's an excellent book, and it's treated by Primo Levi as the greatest book of resistance in the Second World War. Just coming back to Jersey, I have a very slight interest in this story, only that my father, who served 6 years in the army, was part of the task force that took the liberation of the Channel Islands in 1945. And he never actually really discussed much about it, but I did know that there were concentration camps on Guernsey, and Russian prisoners were very badly ill-treated. Many of them were killed, and as you say, many Jews were deported. The thing that occurs to me was that at the time when these two women were arrested, and this is very telling, Simon, you mentioned how Britain effectively deserted the Channel Islands in 1940. In June 1944, when the D-Day landings took place, there was a conscious decision to bypass the Channel Islands because there were so many German troops tied up there that they decided that they'd be better spent defending an island that no one's going to attack than coming to the defense of Western Europe. And in fact, they were left until, as you say, May 1945, when the war was over. It was only when the war was all but over that they eventually surrendered, and they surrendered without a fight. I just wonder, your women were arrested in 1944. Of course, by that time, the D-Day landings had taken place, and it was certain that the Channel Islands would fall sooner or later. And I wonder whether they were given not preferential treatment, but treatment mindful of what was probably coming sooner rather than later, and that's why their sentences were commuted.
I don't know, but that's likely the case. I think there weren't any more deportations happening, and I also read, clearly it was in the book, but there was in terms of executions, there was in Jersey, there was women were not executed in Jersey. So strangely, they were kind of apparently keeping to that custom, or something like that. But as you say, I think the war was anyway, and it wasn't going well. So there was an argument for that.
And there were no Gestapo officers on Jersey either, I don't think.
No, I don't think there was the Gestapo.
And interestingly, the parallel, though, is if you think of Eichmann and what went on in Hungary and so on, I mean, they were shipping people off to death camps,
yes,
where the war was all over, where there were soldiers who needed resources, but they weren't getting them, but they were still applying resources,
yes,
murder lots. So that rationale didn't seem to apply in Jersey, like you say. It was detached. You're exactly right. Their arrest was just after the D-Day landings, because actually the news of the D-Day landings was something they were aware of, and it's spelled out in the book prior to the point at which they were arrested. Yeah.
And what happened to this couple after the war?
So in
good question.
They carried on living in Jersey. Lucy was quite an ill person anyway, and she died in, I think it was 1952. And then Suzanne carried on living in Jersey until the 70s, and then she actually committed suicide. But, you know, yeah, and really they would have been completely written out of history, but her belongings were put up for auction in the 70s, and somebody bought it, but they were in a terrible state. You know, I can't remember his name, but he bought it, and he kind of picked up the 10 boxes, and then they were finding some more photographs on the floor around the corner, and it, you know, it was all over the place. But he eventually negotiated a sale of their documents with the Jersey Heritage Trust, and they've done amazing work to really in recent years to highlight their activities during the war. And there was also other art historians who wrote biographies of Lucy Schwab, Claude Cahun, which is why she is sort of more widely recognized than her partner, Suzanne Malherbe.
What was Lucy's involvement with the Jewish community, if anything, when she lived in France?
All I know is that...
I mean, I'm mindful that the French communities were very often highly assimilated.
Yeah, I think that she came from a highly assimilated family, but the Dreyfus affair, she was feeling the effects of that during her early life, and she would have been very much aware of her Jewish identity through that. And I think she suffered anti-Semitism at school, for instance. So, and in Nantes, in particular, during the Dreyfus affair, I think there was a lot of anti-Semitic activity at the time. So, you know, she was very aware of her Jewish identity. Interesting,
Julian, in terms of the comment about what it was like for them when they were in Jersey after the war and so on. If I quote from the book on page 260, it says, as island residents tried to return to normal, they also retreated back inside their own worlds, leaving Lucy feeling like she was in a place more deserted than the desert, which is the title of that chapter. She wrote later, in moments of isolation, she thought back to the depths of the previous winter and remembered the feeling of solidarity that enveloped her and kept her going through her darkest day in prison. So the sense of community that formed in the midst of danger has now vanished. So, you know, it was all over, and what the hell was it all about? It was like they were in a desert. So yeah.
There are some amazing photographs actually of their time post-war, doing crazy things, like Lucy is walking a cat whilst being blindfolded, or she's dancing in a fairy costume. These women were in their 50s, you know, 50s, in a fairy's costume, dancing along the seafront wall, which was, I think it was built by the Germans, sort of a symbol of freedom.
Their behaviour was very avant-garde, I would think, for a provincial island like Jersey, whereas in the left bank of Paris, it might not have been frowned on to quite the same extent. It felt very out of their comfort zone. or put their neighbours out of their comfort zone, I should say.
Yeah,
I think more so that, yeah.
Yeah.
very much so. Yeah.
Do we have a question here from I can't remember
Kathy.
my eyesight. From Kathy. I'm not the author. Can the author comment on the environment of collaboration with the Nazis, the organized resistance to the Nazis and the saboteurs on the island? How much were they aware of and did participate, sympathize with? So just to clarify, I'm not the author for sure of the book, although it would have been a history I would have loved to have written, but too late. The collaboration with the Nazis, from what I read through the book, was that there were definitely people who collaborated with the Nazis who worked for them. They incentivized people, didn't they, to
reveal,
what's the word, to give over information about dissenters from Nazi rules with money. And I think there was somebody who became so rich off it that they were kind of beaten up by the locals. Correct. Because they were so frustrated at how they were informing on other local Jersey people.
Well, there was also tantamount collaboration by the British authorities, because the policemen who stayed on the island became subordinated, obviously, to the German government, and they would wear the British police uniforms, but they wear Nazi insignia and give the Nazi salute when an officer walked past.
Yeah, even the prison, I think, was also the same relationship there.
Mm.
I mean, in terms of collaboration and so on, I'm sure that it would not compare at all with the collaboration in Poland, which was utterly widespread. They had a very good time ratting out on every Jewish person, never mind stealing belongings and possessions and so on. Our next book for review absolutely goes through all of that and illustrates that, yes.
As did the French.
Yes, well.
As did the French.
More northern than southern, but yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions from anyone or comments? We have got some Holocaust expertise in the audience. As Esther is now smiling.
But I haven't read the book, unfortunately.
You read more books than any of the rest of us.
Oh dear. No, but I know very little about Jersey. But the only thing that did strike me is the kind of spiritual resistance that was going on was kind of, you can draw a parallel with the spiritual resistance in the ghettos in Poland. People resisted when they didn't have bullets, like that's why it's called paper bullets, I presume, in other ways, by writing diaries and testimonies and hiding evidence, to be found after the war and things like that, just to try and get the message across. No one had social media then, so it was a way of communication.
And
sure.
I felt like there was an awareness amongst Lucy and Suzanne that this was the most important part of their lives, and they were writing diaries, writing down with such detail what had happened to them during these years that Jeffrey Jackson's recreated. And there was an awareness of the importance of the moment. And what's interesting is that these propaganda tracks, that clearly that was meant for public attention, for wide dissemination, whereas their photographs, which they are most famous for now, were just private endeavors.
Yeah.
And so this was the work they were most proud of, their very thoughtful and quirky tracks that they were creating, and incredible examples of this spiritual resistance.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I'm finished.
Not a factual comment, just an opinion. I did read the book, but for those of us who have not read this book, I belong to 3 different Jewish book clubs, so I do a lot of reading. This book was definitely different. It was a page turner, beautifully written, and I recommended it to everyone I know.
Great. That's nice.
Good book.
Thank you. Maria.
I'm really grateful. I'd heard it before. There was I think a Jewish Renaissance evening or something. So I'd heard about them, and thank you, because of Tanya, I'd seen the exhibition. And I think it's quite apart from their art and that previous work of the photography and everything, I think it's an incredible story that we as youngsters, Simon and I, we didn't hear about this at all. You didn't hear about Jersey, really. I hardly knew anything about it. That you could have some control in resistance in a quiet way, I think is very empowering. I'm certainly, I have a 15-year-old grandson who's interested, and I think he will get a lot out of this book and learn about something that I don't know if they've ever touched on in school when they've learned about, you know, the Holocaust War and this sort of thing. But I think it's wonderful that there are people who are still interested and put all the effort in, because there must have been a huge amount of research and effort from these bits of scraps of paper and all this sort of thing, and tying it in with the history that is more known, you know, and recorded. So grateful to him to put all this work in so that we know this, because it could so easily have got lost and the guy who bought the stuff at the auction, you know, could have got so lost, and now it's there and exists, and the story will not be forgotten. So thank you.
Yeah.
Esther, your comment about the manner of recording, which took place during the war, which of course had no comparison to what can be done now, literally no comparison. But you think of the Warsaw Diaries, and they're being buried and then rediscovered. And I know we're looking to translate the Rachel Auerbach diaries right now. I've been approached on that. There's so much work that was done, but only discovered later, and presumably so much has never been discovered.
You mean the Oneg Shabbat archive? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fred.
I would just like to go back to Poland. Yes, there was collaboration, but there was also enormous resistance. I mean, Irena Sendler saved countless Jewish children with her work, smuggling them out of Warsaw Ghetto and so on. So I think in every country, there were people who were willing to risk their lives for the Jews, and others, I'm sure homosexuals and so on, were sheltered in certain countries, as well as, of course, the collaborators. But it isn't completely black and white. In each country, there were collaborators, and in each country of the war of Europe, there were people who would fight against the Germans.
You are, of course, absolutely right. And that is illustrated by Yad Vashem, what it does in what's called Righteous Among the Nations, which when it was started, they didn't expect to have many examples. I think the number is well over 29,000 now. And if you think to be categorized as righteous among the nations, it has to be absolutely proven that the people risked their lives. It needed to be that level. So how many that we know of, but how many do we not know of that did risk their lives and paid with their lives? I'm sure it'll dwarf the number that we know. The trouble is that Poland had 3.3 million Jewish people, of which I believe, Esther, you'll have to correct me when I get this wrong, 2.9 million were slaughtered. The trouble is the number of collaborators will have been huge, and the number of righteous will have been tiny in comparison. But you're right, there were wonderful people who in the face of all of that did defend Jewish people. And of course, the Besser exhibition, which is about Armenian, am I going mad, Esther?
Yeah, the Armenian Muslim.
Albanian
was, sorry, thanks, Ev.
There are cells not in my brain working the way they were Albanian. And they were fantastic. It was a tiny Jewish community, but their motto, as it were, is we may be Muslim, but we're defending these people. And in the end, I think 1,500 people, because many people came into Albania in seeking to escape and so on, they survived because of that. And there's a Yad Vashem traveling exhibition, which we have, and we've been having exhibited, celebrating that. So yes, there were a number, a level of heroism did go on. Yeah, thank you, Fred.
Can I just ask Tanya one final question?
Sure.
You showed us a couple of photographs. I assume these were for private purposes, and it was never intended they would be published. But I just wonder whether you think these photographs are, in terms of artistic merit, bear comparison with other art movements at the time, and whether they should have maybe a higher profile.
Yeah, I definitely do. But they are becoming more and more recognized as very important photographic and creative outcomes of the time. They were they were known as in those circles by their artistic names. So Claude Cahun and Marcel were recognized at the time by surrealists, by contemporaries. Claude Cahun participated in the International Surrealist exhibition in 1936. So they were recognized in the 30s as being, as being important artists. But then in some ways they do stand out, particularly in the way in which they explore themes of gender identity. And I think that's why in recent decades they've really been picked up as important art historical records, because they have such contemporary resonance with themes that contemporary artists are working with today. So yes, I definitely think they are, important artists of the time, and should carry on being recognized for what they did.
In the National Portrait Gallery exhibition, the theme of masking was a big centre of attention of the Birmingham artist whose name I can't remember.
Gillian Waring.
Gillian Waring, thank you very much.
I
who was
forgot you said
paralleled
Birmingham.
with Claude Cahun. Claude Cahun similarly did masking, in addition to shaving her head and all the different things she did. So there was a lot to the message that they were actually trying to convey.
Yeah, you're masquerading. I think it was all about performing different types of identities through the photographs. Gillian Waring, that's her thing. She wears masks in every single photograph, or very constructed. So that was really kind of the germination behind the exhibition, was because that was such an important theme to Gillian Waring, which we were able to draw out also through Claude Cahun's work.
Right. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts? Our next book, which I'm now speaking off the top of my head and I don't have it in front of me, is called something like, Sophie, if you want to try and rescue me, this will be unbelievably good. My story is something Surdel, and it's all about a 9-year-old boy who is the only survivor of a small town or village in Poland, and his bravery and thank you so much. Tanya has rescued me.
I don't know.
It is it. My name is Stajek Surdel, and it's all about Natan Poremba, and it's written by Joel Poremba. And I was actually approached on LinkedIn by his wife, Sari. They live in LA. So I immediately ordered the book, and I'm halfway through the book. And even though it's clearly not a bestseller type of book, because I may be halfway through and I've seen about 6 typos already, but the story and the manner in which it's described, it's very revealing. And I think it's a very important book and a very genuine book. So, and he, the author, is going to be the facilitator, if that's the right word, at our next book club event, which is on the 18th of January. And I really look forward to all of you, and hopefully many others also attending. So I think we're sort of more or less, unless anyone's got a final kind of a question, I think we're more or less at the end of our 1 hour. It's been, for me, the best thing in the world to hear my Tanya, my youngest. I'd like to say I'm best, but they're all the best of my wonderful children. I'd like to say it, and I potentially did just say that. So it's been a real privilege to hear your expertise, and I thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Good night.